There's something timeless about the image of a saffron-robed monk, sitting beneath the shade of an ancient Bodhi tree, eyes half closed, lost in the quiet depths of meditation. For more than 2.5 millennia, monks have held a sacred space in Buddhist tradition, not merely as religious figures, but as the custodians of a spiritual legacy that transcends cultures, languages, and even generations. In the early days of Buddhism, after the Buddha attained enlightenment, he didn't keep the truth to himself. Instead, he wandered through forests, cities, and villages, gathering around him those who sought a way out of suffering. Those followers who chose to leave behind the complexities of worldly life, shave their heads, and don the simple robes of renunciation formed the Sangha, the monastic community. The Sangha wasn't just a group of religious people chanting sutras. It was a living, breathing embodiment of the Dharma itself, preserving teachings not through books and scriptures, but through their own lives. Every precept they upheld, every meditation they practiced, every moment they lived with mindfulness was a testament to the possibility of awakening. For laypeople, monks became both teachers and symbols. When life's storms grew too fierce, it was the monks people turned to for wisdom. When moral dilemmas haunted families and communities, the Sangha offered clarity. In a time before smartphones and endless streams of information, guidance came from the steady, deliberate voices of those who had chosen a path beyond worldly attachment. This connection between monks and lay followers became a delicate, yet profound relationship. The lay community provided food, clothing, and shelter, while monks provided spiritual counsel, shared the Dharma, and offered blessings. In this way, a symbiotic bond formed, one rooted in mutual respect and purpose. Even as Buddhism spread beyond the borders of India, into Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Tibet, China, and eventually to the West, this dynamic remained. The image of monks traveling to remote villages, teaching under trees, or meditating in isolated caves remained etched in the cultural memory of countless societies. They became the bridges between the ordinary and the sacred, between the seen and the unseen. And yet, as centuries passed, something else took root alongside this tradition. A tendency, subtle at first but increasingly visible. People began to place monks on pedestals not just as teachers but as infallible figures. Devotion morphed into dependence. Faith blurred into blind following. The monk, once a guide on the path, risked becoming the destination itself. Why does this matter? Because when spiritual leadership is idolized without question, the heart of the practice can get lost. Buddhism, at its core, was never meant to be about personalities or positions. The Buddha himself rejected titles and refused to appoint a spiritual heir, declaring that each person must be their own refuge. But somewhere in the long arc of history, that fierce emphasis on self-reliance grew quieter. In temples filled with incense and golden statues, it became easier to believe that proximity to a monk, or listening to their words, could substitute for personal effort. People began believing that wisdom could be transferred like a blessing, or that enlightenment might be granted through another's touch. And so today, we find ourselves at a curious crossroads. In an age of spiritual teachers with millions of followers, social media monks with viral wisdom quotes, and online gurus promising instant awakening, the question becomes unavoidable. Should you rely fully on monks in your spiritual practice? It's a question both ancient and modern. It invites us to look at the very foundation of Buddhist tradition, to honor its wisdom while being unafraid to examine its shadows. It reminds us that while monks can illuminate the path, no one can walk it for us. This is not a dismissal of monastic life, far from it. The monastic community remains one of the most precious jewels in the Buddhist world, but it is a call to remember what their role was always meant to be. Guides, not gods. Mirrors, not masters. To truly understand this, we need to explore not only the history of spiritual reliance but also the risks of blind faith. It's a journey into the tension between devotion and discernment, between tradition and personal responsibility. And it begins by recognizing the limits of even the most well-intentioned guidance. Because no matter how serene the monk, how ancient the temple, or how eloquent the sermon, the path to awakening is one we must each walk alone. There's a delicate line between reverence and dependency, a line so thin it often vanishes without us noticing. It begins innocently enough, a troubled heart, a search for meaning, a kind monk offering solace. And in that moment of vulnerability, it feels as if someone else holds the key to our peace. Human beings crave certainty. In a world constantly shifting beneath our feet, we long for something unshakable. Spiritual teachers, especially monks, often become that anchor. Their calm presence, their words laced with ancient wisdom, seem to offer exactly what we need. And so we lean in closer, we listen, we believe, we follow. At first, it feels like freedom. The burden of making sense of our own chaos is lifted, replaced by the soothing assurance of someone else's guidance. But slowly, without realizing it, our faith transforms. It stops being a bridge to understanding and becomes a cage made of unquestioned devotion. Buddhism, in its earliest form, warned of this. The Buddha himself cautioned his disciples against clinging to any authority, even his own. In the Sutta, he urged seekers not to accept something simply because it came from a respected figure or ancient tradition. Instead, one should observe, reflect, and see for oneself whether a teaching leads to peace or to suffering. And yet, the pattern repeats. Across cultures and centuries, people have handed over their inner compass in exchange for the comfort of being led. It's understandable. The path of self-discovery can be lonely and terrifying. It asks us to confront our own ignorance, our attachments, our illusions. Having someone to follow feels so much easier. But here's the paradox. The very reliance that promises ease often deepens suffering. When faith turns into dependency, it strips us of agency. We stop questioning. We silence our doubts. We believe that if we just follow closely enough, chant sincerely enough, offer generously enough, someone else will carry us to awakening. This isn't unique to Buddhism. Every spiritual tradition faces this risk. The danger lies not in devotion itself, but in what happens when devotion blinds discernment. A monk may offer profound guidance, but no one can escape the laws of impermanence, no matter how wise. Their insight can light our path, but it cannot shield us from the storms of our own karma. Stories abound of followers so entranced by a teacher's charisma that they abandon their own wisdom. Monks, too, being human, can falter. History holds accounts of revered spiritual leaders who, intoxicated by power or adoration, lost sight of their own vows. When followers surrender discernment, the consequences ripple outward, creating not just personal suffering, but damage to entire communities. And yet, most dangerously, the greatest loss isn't in scandals or betrayals. It's in the quiet erosion of personal effort. The belief that enlightenment can be outsourced, that wisdom can be inherited through proximity, is perhaps the most tragic illusion. The Dharma was never meant to be a spectator sport. Awakening isn't something to be handed down. It must be realized in the unlit corners of our own hearts. When we rely blindly, we postpone that encounter. We trade the raw, difficult beauty of direct experience for second-hand wisdom. To practice Buddhism authentically is to walk a path of courage. It means respecting teachers without worshiping them. It means learning from monks while knowing they, too, are walking their own journey. It means understanding that no blessing, no ritual, no holy relic can substitute for self-awareness. True faith is not about believing without question. It's about trusting in the process of awakening while being endlessly curious about its unfolding. It's about having the humility to seek guidance and the wisdom to test it against your own experience. As the old Zen saying goes, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. A shocking phrase at first, but its meaning is profoundly compassionate. It warns against idolizing even the highest spiritual image. Because the moment we place ultimate authority outside ourselves, we become spiritually orphaned. Dependency masquerades as devotion. It soothes us with the illusion of certainty, even as it quietly dismantles our inner strength. And while monks may serve as extraordinary companions on the path, they were never meant to be the destination. Every teaching, every ritual, every prayer is a finger pointing at the moon. If we keep staring at the finger, we miss the vast, luminous sky beyond. It's a hard truth, but a necessary one. Because only by recognizing the limits of blind reliance can we begin to reclaim the practice as our own. Not a path walked for us, not a wisdom delivered to us, but a journey we choose to undertake. Imagine standing alone at dusk on a quiet shore. The tide moves in gentle waves, brushing your feet. The sun dips low, painting the water in liquid gold. And for a moment, the world feels vast, indifferent, yet strangely intimate, as if the ocean itself is reminding you. No one is coming to save you, but you don't need saving. This was the essence of what the Buddha taught. In his final days, as his disciples gathered around him, anxious and grieving, they asked one last, desperate question: "Who will guide us when you are gone?" And the Buddha, with infinite compassion, answered not by naming a successor, but by offering a truth so radical it still unsettles us centuries later. He said, "Be a lamp unto yourselves. Be your own refuge. Take no other refuge." In those few words lies the heart of Buddhist wisdom, a call to self-reliance so pure and uncompromising, it defies our deepest craving for external saviors. The world often teaches us to look outward. We're conditioned to believe that happiness, meaning, and safety come from things beyond ourselves, from lovers, from leaders, from gods, from gurus. But the Buddha shattered this illusion, not with harshness, but with a clarity born from his own awakening. He knew what it meant to search. Before enlightenment, he too sought salvation from hermits, ascetics, priests. He followed harsh disciplines, hoping to silence the storm inside. And each time he was left with the same ache, a hunger no one else could fill. It wasn't until he turned inward, sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, that the final breakthrough came. There, stripped of all teachers and doctrines, with only his own breath and awareness, he touched the unconditioned. He realized that what he had sought was never elsewhere. It had always been here. This is what he meant when he spoke of the island within, a sanctuary untouched by the tides of fortune, untouched by the praise and blame of others, a refuge not made of temples or scriptures, but of clear seeing. And here's the hard part: no one can build that island for you. A monk can point you toward it, a teacher can offer a map, but the walk, the labor, the silence, that belongs to you alone. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha put it plainly: by oneself is evil done, by oneself is one made pure. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another. It's a truth that's both terrifying and liberating. Because if no one can walk this path for you, then no one can stop you either. You are not at the mercy of a mercurial fate. You are not a pawn in the hands of an angry god or a capricious destiny. The conditions of your life may be harsh, your karma heavy, but your mind remains your own. And within that mind lies the power to awaken. This teaching isn't a rejection of community or guidance. Buddhism has always valued the Sangha, the community of practitioners, as one of its three great treasures. But the Sangha exists to support, not to substitute. A wise monk may steady your hand, offer counsel when your vision clouds. Yet at the end of every teaching, the question is the same: what do you see? That seeing, raw, unmediated, terrifying in its honesty, is yours alone. The Buddha never demanded blind belief. He invited exploration. His was not a doctrine of dogma, but of direct experience. Ehipasiko, he would say, come and see for yourself. Because faith without inquiry is fragile. It withers in the face of suffering. But understanding born from your own insight, that becomes unshakable. No monk, no master, no scripture can steal it from you. The island within is not a place you reach. It's a presence you uncover, breath by breath, as illusions fall away. It's the quiet clarity that arises when you stop seeking elsewhere and finally turn to face yourself. Not the curated self you present to the world, but the raw, aching, restless being beneath. And in that meeting, something extraordinary happens. The craving for external validation begins to soften. The desperate need for approval, for certainty, for a spiritual authority to bless your path, it loosens its grip. You start to see that the wisdom you sought in ancient words and distant teachers was never absent. It waited patiently in the stillness of your own awareness. This is not easy work. It's easier to outsource our enlightenment, to hope that a monk's blessing or a holy object will shortcut the struggle. But every genuine practitioner, sooner or later, reaches a point where the only way forward is in, through the thick, tangled jungle of their own mind. And those who walk it discover something the world rarely speaks of, the profound, luminous solitude at the heart of awakening. Not loneliness, not isolation, but a solitude so complete it makes you whole. In the end, the true refuge isn't found in temples or in rituals or even in wise teachers. It's found in a mind that sees clearly, in a heart that lets go, in a being that no longer seeks elsewhere what it already carries within. The island is always there. The question, there's a subtle danger in every spiritual journey, one so quiet, so elegantly disguised, it often feels like wisdom itself. It begins the moment you find a teacher, a book, a teaching that resonates so deeply it feels as if the universe finally spoke your language. And in that comfort, a temptation grows, to trade your restless seeking for the warmth of certainty, to let someone else's words become your truth, to believe that following their steps precisely will lead you to the same awakening. But no two awakenings are alike. The Buddha himself knew this. Though revered as the greatest of teachers, he never placed himself on a pedestal. Instead, he described his role as a finger pointing at the moon. The tragedy is when we mistake the finger for the moon. Guidance is essential. A map matters when you first enter unknown territory. A wise companion can warn you of the cliffs and swamps ahead. But if you never lift your gaze from the map to see the actual landscape, if you cling to the path others drew without testing its ground beneath your own feet, you'll live your life in shadows. Direct experience isn't a rejection of teaching, it's the fulfillment of it. Every genuine spiritual tradition recognizes this paradox. The master offers direction, but it's incomplete until it's verified in the furnace of your own life. No amount of reading about fire will keep you warm. No string of eloquent verses can quench your thirst like a single sip of water. In the Kalama Sutta, one of the Buddha's most famous discourses, a group of villagers once came to him, confused. So many teachers passed through their land, each claiming to hold the ultimate truth. Whom should we believe? They asked, and the Buddha, rather than demanding allegiance, gave them a radical instruction. Do not go by reports, by traditions, by hearsay. Do not go by the authority of sacred texts. Do not go by logic or by inference. But when you know for yourselves that certain things are wholesome, blameless, praised by the wise, and lead to welfare and happiness, then accept them and live by them. It wasn't a license for reckless self-indulgence. It was a challenge. Test the teachings. See what happens when you apply them. Watch your own mind. Notice the effects. Then you'll know not because someone told you, but because you've lived it. This is where the dance happens between guidance and direct experience. If you rely solely on yourself, without the wisdom of those who have walked ahead, you risk wandering endlessly in circles. Pride can masquerade as insight. Ego can whisper in the voice of intuition. The forest of the mind is dense and easy to get lost in, but if you cling only to others' footsteps, you rob yourself of discovery. The path becomes a performance, not a pilgrimage. And no second-hand enlightenment has ever saved a restless heart. The great masters understood this. They never asked for blind loyalty. Even Zen, a tradition famous for its lineage of teachers, thrives on irreverence. Its history is filled with students who challenge their masters, who burned scriptures, who dared to laugh at solemn rituals. Not from arrogance, but because they realized awakening cannot be borrowed. A monk may show you the threshold, but you must cross it. This balance isn't easy. It requires humility to receive guidance and courage to question it. It demands reverence for wisdom and irreverence for dogma. It asks you to be both student and rebel, disciplined and wild. Because ultimately, what matters is not what you believe, but what you realize. You can memorize the Eightfold Path, recite the Four Noble Truths, wear robes, chant at dawn, and still be untouched by genuine freedom. Or you can sit in silence one evening, watching your breath rise and fall, and glimpse in that moment a truth no scripture ever captured. The teachings are not the destination. They are tools. Rafts to cross a river, as the Buddha famously said. Cling to the raft after reaching the shore, and it becomes a burden. This is why, throughout Buddhist history, the most luminous moments have often come when disciples stepped beyond their teachers. Not in betrayal, but in fulfillment. When Mahakasyapa smiled silently at a flower the Buddha held up without a word. When Bodhidharma stared at a Chinese emperor's request for merit and said, "There is no merit." When an unnamed monk threw down his begging bowl and laughed under the Bodhi tree. These moments weren't blasphemy. They were the flowering of direct experience. In your own practice, the question isn't whether to have teachers, but whether you're willing to eventually outgrow them. Not with disdain, but with gratitude. Because the greatest gift a teacher can offer is not a doctrine, but a mirror. A way of turning you back to yourself, until you no longer seek validation in their eyes. And then you begin to walk clumsy at first, uncertain, tasting your own solitude. Some days the path vanishes beneath your feet. Some days you glimpse a beauty too vast for words. Each step makes you less a follower, more a finder. Until one day, perhaps, you realize, the guidance was never outside you. It was the wisdom of your own heart, speaking in voices the world once called monks and masters. And in that recognition, the balance is complete. There's a peculiar thing about human nature. The moment we encounter someone who radiates peace, wisdom, or a presence beyond our own, we feel drawn like moths to a flame. It's instinctive, almost primal. In the presence of those we believe are enlightened, it's tempting to surrender not just our doubts, but our discernment. And so begins one of the oldest traps in the history of spirituality, turning devotion into idolization. Throughout time, charismatic figures have gathered followers, some genuinely wise, others dangerously deluded. And when charisma blends with spiritual authority, the line between inspiration and blind obedience can vanish. We don't fall for this because we're foolish. We fall because, deep down, we long for certainty, a voice to tell us what's right, a guide to carry the burden of choice. In a world of shifting truths, a person who seems unshakable feels like a lighthouse in a storm. But here's the truth Buddhism has quietly whispered for centuries. No one, not even a saintly monk in crimson robes, can walk your path for you. The Buddha himself warned against this. He saw how devotion could distort. Even in his lifetime, followers began attributing miraculous powers to him, stories of walking on water, reading minds, bending nature to his will. And while these tales lit up imaginations, they risked obscuring what mattered most. His human example. He didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. But when reverence turns to idolization, subtle dangers creep in. Charismatic leaders, even well-intentioned ones, can become living symbols of perfection. Their words cease to be teachings and turn into unquestionable truths. Their flaws are ignored, their mistakes excused. And slowly, a community once built on shared inquiry transforms into a hierarchy of silent followers. In the modern world, this takes on new forms. A magnetic monk with thousands of social media followers. A teacher whose every quote goes viral. A guru whose image is etched onto amulets and phone screens. The old robes may be traded for digital avatars, but the pattern remains. Devotion, unexamined, breeds dependency. This isn't a condemnation of spiritual teachers. Many are sincere, compassionate, and deeply committed. The danger isn't in their wisdom, but in our willingness to surrender too much of ourselves. When we place any person, no matter how wise, on a pedestal too high, we risk losing sight of our own potential. Their light, instead of illuminating our path, blinds us. And when criticism is silenced in the name of respect, when questions are dismissed as disloyalty, when doubts are labeled as weakness, what once was a sangha becomes a cult. Buddhist history carries warnings about this. Even great teachers like Milarepa and Tilopa advised their disciples to test them, to question everything. Zen stories tell of monks who, upon sensing their master's ego creeping in, would deliberately challenge them, not out of disrespect, but to protect the integrity of the path. Because no genuine wisdom fears inquiry. In fact, the strongest teachings invite it. They remain resilient under scrutiny, like a diamond polished by doubt. A teacher secure in their own awakening doesn't demand devotion. They encourage independence, but the allure of charismatic authority persists precisely because it soothes something in us. It offers easy answers. It grants us an identity by association. If I follow this great one, I too am elevated. It's spiritual proxy, outsourcing our awakening to another's image. Yet every tradition worth its salt insists on one stubborn fact: enlightenment can't be borrowed. You cannot awaken by proximity. You cannot inherit wisdom through loyalty. The deepest truths reveal themselves only in the quiet of your own heart, often in the absence of any audience or approval. And so the antidote is not cynicism, but clarity. Honor those who inspire you. Learn from their words. Bow if you wish, not to their perfection, but to the wisdom they reflect back to you. And then, step beyond the shadow of their charisma. Because ultimately, every teacher, no matter how luminous, is still human. A finger pointing at the moon. A voice reminding you of a truth you've always carried, waiting to be remembered. The danger isn't in admiring them. The danger lies in believing they are the source of your light. Real devotion is fierce. It doesn't shrink from truth. It loves the teacher but loves wisdom more. It respects the sangha but treasures authenticity above belonging. The monks, the masters, the wise, they are invaluable, not as idols but as companions. Maps for moments when you are lost, mirrors for when you forget yourself, but never replacements for your own clear seeing. Because the Buddha's final instruction wasn't a command to obey, but a blessing of freedom. Be a lamp unto yourself. And perhaps there, in that simple act of reclaiming your authority, your discernment, your responsibility, you find a devotion unshaken by charisma and untouched by idolatry. A devotion to truth itself. That's the kind of devotion no one can steal. Truth has a peculiar quality. The more someone claims to own it, the further it slips from their grasp. In the long history of spiritual traditions, countless teachers have risen, each carrying the light of wisdom in their hands. Some with sincerity, some with arrogance. And too often, what begins as a pure offering turns into possession. Words of compassion are trademarked. Teachings are fenced off. And Dharma, the very heart of awakening, is treated like personal property. But here's a profound, liberating truth that cuts through centuries of illusion. Dharma belongs to no one, not to monks, not to temples, not to lineages, not even to the words of ancient scriptures. Dharma is like the wind. You can feel it on your skin, hear it in the rustling of leaves, watch it move across a still pond, but no one can hold it. No hand is big enough, no mind wide enough to contain it. The Buddha never claimed ownership of Dharma. He didn't invent it. He discovered it, the way one might discover a hidden spring in a dense forest. It was there before him. It would remain after him. All he did was clear the overgrown path so others might find it more easily. He called it akaliko, timeless. Beyond culture, beyond tradition, beyond labels. a truth that belongs not to the East or West, not to monks or laypeople, but to anyone with the courage to look directly at life. And yet human nature loves control. Over the centuries, factions formed, schools of thought splintered, teachers debated whose interpretation was more correct, texts were hoarded, access restricted. Spiritual hierarchies rose, with those at the top claiming privileged knowledge. Dharma, once as open as the sky, was confined within walls of ritual, lineage, and authority. But the Dharma is not a relic. It's not a membership card. It's not a secret doctrine passed from master to disciple behind closed doors. It's life itself. The way a flower leans toward light. The way the heart softens in the face of kindness. The quiet ache of impermanence as seasons change and loved ones fade. It's here now, unfolding in every breath you take. No one can sell it to you. No one can deny it to you. And no one can monopolize it. Charismatic monks may speak beautifully. Famous teachers may gather vast followings. Ancient texts may claim to hold exclusive revelations. But if a teaching requires you to believe it belongs solely to one person, one sect, or one tradition, be wary. Because the Buddha's wisdom wasn't meant to bind you. It was meant to set you free. He taught with open hands, often in forests, by rivers, on dusty roads. His Sangha was a gathering of outcasts, merchants, kings, beggars, and wanderers. The Dharma flowed freely among them, like rain that falls without choosing where to land. And perhaps that's its most precious quality. It belongs to whoever lives it. You don't need to be ordained. You don't need a title. The wisdom of impermanence will visit you whether you wear saffron robes or a business suit. The truth of suffering will greet you whether you meditate in a monastery or stand in line at a crowded bus station. The quiet joy of compassion, the emptiness beneath your fleeting worries, these require no membership, no initiation. In fact, the most dangerous spiritual environments are those that claim exclusive rights to truth, where certain monks declare themselves gatekeepers, where ancient words are twisted into tools of control, where questioning is punished and curiosity suppressed. Real Dharma thrives on questions. It invites skepticism. It flourishes when examined from all angles. It welcomes anyone, no matter how lost, angry, or broken. The Buddhist scriptures remind us of this beautifully. There's a story of a simple farmer who, upon hearing the Buddha speak, wept not because of the brilliance of the words, but because he realized he had known these truths in his heart all along. No monk had revealed it to him. No scripture had validated it. Life itself had been teaching him quietly through hardship and love. That's the nature of Dharma. It's not something you acquire. It's something you remember. When a teaching resonates, it's not because it's new, but because it stirs something ancient and timeless within you. A recognition beyond words. This is why Buddhism, at its best, isn't about conformity. It's about inner revolution. It asks you to become intimate with your own mind, to watch the rising and falling of thought, to observe your attachments, your fears, your joys, and to realize that every moment offers a fresh opportunity for awakening. When Dharma is truly alive, it doesn't create followers. It awakens equals. And those who realize this truth become guardians of humility. They don't hoard wisdom. They share it like warmth from a fire. They don't demand loyalty. They encourage independence, because they know the Dharma's greatest beauty lies in its ownerlessness. The wind belongs to no one. The light of dawn is owned by no name. And the truth, the kind that ends suffering and births freedom, belongs to anyone brave enough to seek it. So as you walk this path, honor the teachers, respect the Sangha, study the texts, but never let anyone convince you that Dharma lives solely within their walls. It's in your breath, in the falling rain, in the silent ache of a parting glance, and most of all, in the mirror. This is where the most sacred teachings have always lived. As we come to the close of this journey, it's fitting to return to the heart of the Buddha's teaching, the middle path, a way of walking between extremes, avoiding the traps of blind reliance and reckless independence, a path that invites both respect and freedom, devotion and discernment. Monks and spiritual teachers have long been beacons in the vast, often confusing landscape of practice. Their wisdom, dedication, and example light the way for many seekers. They remind us of what's possible when the mind is trained, the heart opened, and the body disciplined. Yet the middle path teaches us that no one can be our spiritual crutch forever. The true teacher lives within. The Buddha's final charge was not to cling, but to awaken, to look inward, to test everything against your own experience. It's here in this balance that real practice unfolds. Respect the guidance of those who have walked the path before you, but hold your own truth close. Learn from the monks, but do not idolize them. Follow the teachings, but never surrender your curiosity or your responsibility to question. In this way, the practice becomes a dance, fluid, alive, and deeply personal. You become both student and teacher, explorer and home. The Sangha becomes not a place of dependence, but a community of companions who challenge and support each other's awakening. Because wisdom beyond authority is not about rejecting teachers. It's about transcending the need for external validation. It's about embracing the freedom to find your own way, sometimes guided, sometimes stumbling, always awakening. This is the middle path of practice. It is neither blind faith nor isolated struggle. It is the courage to walk the line between them, with eyes wide open and heart unshaken. So, as you move forward, carry these truths with you. The path is yours to walk. The light you seek is already within, and every step, whether led by a monk's voice or your own silent insight, is sacred. May your